I never imagined that a simple photograph could demolish everything I believed I knew about my own family. My name is Margaret. I'm 46 years old, a literature teacher in a small town in the countryside, and I always prided myself on having built a home based on honesty, transparency, and unconditional love. My husband Robert and I raised our only son Thomas with all the values we considered essential to forming a man of character. He was always a quiet boy, studious, responsible, one of those who never gave us major concerns during adolescence. While other parents complained about rebellious children, low grades, and risky behaviors, we just watched Thomas grow almost perfectly, as if we had hit the jackpot of parenthood. But there's something I learned on that fateful March day, when the photograph fell from the pocket of his jeans while I was sorting dirty laundry to wash. We never truly know people, not even those we carried in our womb for 9 months, whom we cradled in our arms during sleepless nights, whom we taught to take their first steps and pronounce their first words. It was an ordinary Tuesday, one of those days when routine flows without major events. Robert had left early for the accounting office where he's worked for over 20 years, and Thomas was at university attending his civil engineering classes. I had a few free hours between my morning and afternoon classes, so I decided to get ahead on household chores. The basket of dirty clothes was overflowing, accumulated during a particularly hectic week. I began separating the pieces by color and fabric, an automatic ritual I've done thousands of times over the years. Robert's shirts always go to one side, my blouses to another. Thomas's jeans form a separate pile because he insists on using that specific fabric softener I buy just for him. It was when I picked up one of those pants, a dark blue Levi's he wears constantly, that I felt something slide from the back pocket and fall to the floor with an almost imperceptible sound. Initially, I thought it was just a receipt or perhaps some unimportant paper. Thomas was always one of those who forgets things in his pockets: parking tickets, class notes, shopping lists scribbled in haste. I bent down to pick up what had fallen, more by reflex than real interest. But when my fingers touched that slightly aged piece of photographic paper, something inside me changed even before my eyes processed the image. Have you ever felt that strange sensation that you're about to discover something that will change everything? That knot in your stomach that precedes life's great revelations? That's exactly what I experienced in that moment, crouched on the laundry room floor, holding between my fingers a photograph that shouldn't be there, that didn't make sense to exist, that completely contradicted the narrative I had built about my family and about my son. The photograph showed Thomas, there was no doubt it was him, but a version of him I had never seen. He was somewhere that appeared to be a poorly lit basement or cellar, surrounded by at least 6 or 7 other people I didn't recognize. Everyone seemed to be between 17 and their early 20s, wearing dark clothes, some with symbols I couldn't clearly identify due to the image quality. What caught my attention most, what made my heart race and my hands begin to tremble, was the expression on my son's face. It wasn't the kind, smiling Thomas I knew, the one who helped elderly people cross the street and who offered to take care of the neighbor's dog when they traveled. It was a young man with cold, almost empty eyes, holding something in his hands I couldn't distinguish well, but which appeared to be some kind of chain or metal object. In the background of the photograph, slightly out of focus but still visible, was what appeared to be a mural or wall covered with disturbing writings and drawings. I sat right there on the cold laundry room floor, unable to move my legs, which suddenly seemed to have lost all strength. I turned the photograph over, looking for some date, some notation, anything that could give me context, but the back was completely blank. I analyzed the image again, this time more carefully, trying to identify details that could help me understand when and where this had been taken. By the clothes and Thomas's haircut, I estimated the photo was at most 2 or 3 years old. He must have been about 19 there, perhaps at the beginning of college. But how was it possible that I knew nothing about this? How could a mother who always considered herself present and attentive have completely missed signs that her son was involved in something that, by the appearance of that photograph, seemed at the very least concerning? I sat there for how long? I can't say exactly. It could have been 10 minutes or an hour. Time seemed to distort in that small room that smelled of detergent and fabric softener. My mind began frantically going through all the events of recent years, searching for clues I might have ignored, signs I might have misinterpreted. Was there any change in Thomas's behavior during this period? Did he become more reserved? Did he start going out more at night? Did he make new friends he never introduced us to? The more I thought, the more I noticed small changes that at the time seemed to me just a natural part of growth and independence of a young adult, but that now, under the revealing light of that photograph, took on potentially much darker meanings. I remember that about 2 years ago, Thomas began spending more time locked in his room. When Robert or I knocked on the door, he always took a few seconds to open, and when he finally did, he seemed slightly nervous, as if he had been interrupted in something important. At the time, I attributed this to the typical need for privacy of a teenager becoming an adult. After all, what 19-year-old wants his parents entering his room all the time? There was also that period when he began wearing almost exclusively black or dark gray clothes, abandoning the more vibrant colors he used to prefer. When I commented on this, he simply laughed and said he was just changing his style, that it was a phase, that all college students go through this. And I believed it, because I wanted to believe, because it's much more comfortable to accept superficial explanations than to dig deep and discover uncomfortable truths. Is there any specific event that should have alarmed me more? Yes, now that I look back with this new perspective, I realize there is. There was that night, about 18 months ago, when Thomas came home at 3 a.m, well beyond the agreed-upon time. He had never disrespected curfew before. He was religiously punctual. When I heard him enter through the front door, I immediately went downstairs to find out what had happened. I found him standing in the dark living room, only illuminated by the faint light from the street lamp coming through the window. He seemed different that night. Something in his eyes, in his posture, was strange. When I asked where he had been, he mumbled something about having lost track of time talking with friends, but his voice sounded hollow, distant, as if he were reading a script he hadn't memorized properly. I pressed for more details, but he just repeated the same vague story and went up to his room. Robert, who had woken up with the noise, came down soon after and told me not to be too hard on the boy, that he was growing up and deserved a bit of freedom. I agreed, because again it was easier to agree than to insist and possibly create an unnecessary conflict. Still holding that photograph between fingers that no longer trembled only from shock but also from growing anger, I began to question everything I thought I knew about my role as a mother. Was I negligent? Was I blind by choice? Was I one of those mothers who see only what they want to see, who build an idealized version of their children and refuse to recognize any evidence that contradicts that perfect image? Guilt began to settle in my chest, like a physical weight, a pressure that made breathing difficult. Dark thoughts began to invade my mind. What if Thomas was involved in something really dangerous? What if those people in the photograph were part of some radical or criminal group? What if my son, my sweet and responsible Thomas, was living a double life that I was completely unable to imagine? I finally got up from the laundry room floor, put the photograph in my apron pocket, and tried to continue with household chores. But it was impossible to concentrate on anything. I put the clothes in the washing machine mechanically, without paying real attention to what I was doing. My mind was completely occupied trying to decide what to do with that discovery. Should I confront Thomas immediately? Should I wait and investigate more before accusing him of anything? Should I tell Robert first and decide together how to proceed? Each option seemed to bring its own set of complications and risks. If I confronted Thomas directly without more information, he could simply invent a convincing story, and I would have no way to verify if he was telling the truth. If I waited and investigated alone, I ran the risk of further invading his privacy and possibly destroying any trust that still existed between us. If I told Robert first, how would he react? My husband always had an especially close relationship with our son, They shared interests, watched games together, had their private conversations from which I was frequently left out. Could Robert already know something and have hidden it from me? Was I the only one completely in the dark? The hours until Thomas's return from university were the longest of my life. I tried to distract myself preparing dinner, grading my students' papers, watching television, but nothing worked. That photograph burned in my apron pocket as if it were a piece of burning coal. Every time I heard a car passing on the street, my whole body tensed, thinking it was him arriving. What questions should I ask? How to approach the subject without sounding too accusatory, but also without being so soft that he wouldn't take it seriously? I mentally rehearsed various versions of the conversation, imagining different reactions he might have. In my head, sometimes he immediately confessed everything and explained it was just a bad joke among college friends. Sometimes he exploded in defensive anger, accusing me of invading his privacy and violating his trust. When I finally heard the key turning in the lock around 6 in the evening, my heart raced. Thomas entered the house with his backpack on his back, headphones around his neck, exactly as he did every day. He greeted me with a casual wave and a carefree, "Hi, Mom," threw his backpack on the living room sofa, and headed to the kitchen, asking what was for dinner. It was normality personified, the routine repeated thousands of times. But now each of his gestures seemed loaded with hidden meanings. Was that smile genuine or a mask? Was that relaxed tone real or a carefully rehearsed performance? I answered something generic about dinner being almost ready and asked him to sit down because we needed to talk. Something in my tone must have alerted him because his expression changed instantly. The smile disappeared, replaced by visible caution. "Talk about what?" he asked, and there was a tension in his voice he couldn't completely disguise. I didn't respond immediately. I removed the photograph from my apron pocket with slow and deliberate movements, as if I were disarming a bomb that could explode at any moment. I placed it on the kitchen table between us and simply pushed it in his direction without saying a word. I watched his reaction attentively. First came recognition. His eyes widened slightly when he identified the image. Then came something that seemed to be panic, quickly suppressed. His jaw contracted and he swallowed hard. Finally came the attempt at composure. He picked up the photograph, looked at it briefly, and put it back on the table with a gesture that tried to be casual, but was clearly forced. "Where did you find this?" was all he managed to say initially. His voice was strangely controlled, too low, as if he were making a conscious effort not to show emotion. I explained that it had fallen from his pants pocket while I was sorting laundry to wash. He remained silent for long seconds that seemed to stretch eternally. His eyes didn't meet mine, fixed on some undefined point on the table. I could see the conflict happening inside him, the internal struggle between different impulses. Lie and deny, minimize the importance, attack my invasion of privacy, or perhaps, just perhaps, finally tell the truth. "Thomas," I said, and my voice came out firmer than I expected. "I need you to be completely honest with me now. Who are these people? Where was this photo taken? What were you doing?" He finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes at that moment scared me more than the photograph itself. It wasn't just fear or guilt. There was also a coldness, a distance I had never seen before. It was as if I were looking at a stranger who just coincidentally had my son's face. "You wouldn't understand," he said finally, and there was bitter resignation in his voice. "It's not something that can be easily explained, and you've already formed your opinion anyway, haven't you?" This response irritated me deeply. It's not something that can be easily explained? What kind of answer was that? I insisted he try to explain anyway, that I deserved to know what my son was involved in, that as his mother, I had the right to understand what was happening in his life. He laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of humor. It was a harsh and unpleasant sound I had never heard coming from him. "Right?" he repeated. "You think you have the right to know everything about my life? I'm 21 years old, Mom. I'm an adult. I have the right to privacy, to have parts of my life that don't involve you or Dad. Technically, he was correct, of course. But there was something in the way he said it, in the barely disguised hostility behind the words, that made me realize we were entering new and dangerous territory in our relationship. I tried to change approaches, soften my tone. I explained that I wasn't trying to invade his privacy, that I was just concerned because that photograph showed something that seemed potentially dangerous or problematic. I asked if he was okay. If he was in some kind of trouble, I could help him resolve. But he just shook his head, a mixture of frustration and something that seemed to be disappointment. "You look at this photo and automatically assume the worst," he said, his voice now loaded with contained emotion. "You see dark clothes, an environment you don't recognize, people you don't know, and immediately conclude, I'm involved in something wrong, dangerous, criminal perhaps. It never crosses your mind that there might be a perfectly innocent explanation? That it might just be a moment captured out of context?" He had a valid point, I admit. I had indeed jumped to conclusions without having all the facts. But I also couldn't ignore my maternal instincts that screamed something was wrong, that image showed something more than just a moment out of context. I then asked him to give me the context, to explain exactly what was happening in that photograph. Where was that place? Who were those people? Why was he keeping that specific photo in his pocket? He sighed deeply, ran his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration I knew well, and finally began to speak. According to him, it was simply a meeting of an alternative study group he had participated in during the second semester of college. A group that met to discuss philosophy, mainly authors, and currents of thought that weren't addressed in the traditional curriculum. Controversial thinkers, ideas that challenged social conventions, deep questions about the nature of morality, power, organized society. "And why did this study group meet in a basement that looks like a horror movie set?" I asked, unable to hide the skepticism in my voice. He explained that was the only available space one of the members managed to arrange for free, that it was part of the basement of an abandoned house a friend had inherited. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't comfortable, but it was private and allowed discussions without interruptions. As for the dark clothes and the somber atmosphere of the photo, he said it was simply an aesthetic coincidence, that there was no deeper meaning to it. "You're reading things into the image that don't exist," he insisted. "It's just a bad photo taken in an ugly place of normal people having intellectual conversations." I wanted to believe him. I really did. It would be much easier to accept this simple explanation and continue with our life as if nothing had happened. But there was something that didn't fit. Something in his body language, in the way his eyes averted from mine at certain moments of the explanation, in the defensive way he presented the facts. "And why did you never mention this group before?" I asked. "Why did you never talk about these philosophical discussions? You always shared your academic activities with us." He shrugged and said he didn't think it would be interesting to us, that it was something very specific, very technical, that Robert and I wouldn't have appreciated or understood the nuances of the discussions. There was condescension in that answer that hurt me. As if I, a literature teacher with a master's degree, wasn't capable of understanding philosophical discussions. As if Robert, a man who read extensively about history and politics, was intellectually too limited to follow conversations about critical thinking. But I decided not to focus on that aspect at that moment. There were more important questions to be addressed. "And does this group still exist?" I asked. "Do you still meet with these people?" He hesitated before answering, and it was in that hesitation that I realized there was more to the story than he was willing to share. "No," he said finally. "The group disbanded about a year ago. People went different ways, graduated, moved to different cities. It was a temporary thing." If it had disbanded a year ago, why was he still carrying that specific photograph in his pocket? I asked this question and saw that I had cornered him. He stumbled over his words trying to formulate an answer, said something about having recently found the photo while organizing old things and having forgotten to take it out of his pocket. But the explanation was weak, and we both knew it. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with unspoken truths and growing mutual distrust. I didn't completely believe his story. He knew I didn't believe it. And we were both aware that we had reached an impasse in our relationship where the trust that was once absolute was now irreparably cracked. At that moment, we heard the front door opening. Robert had arrived from work. Thomas immediately got up from the table, grabbed the photograph, and quickly put it in his pocket before his father could see it. "Don't tell him," Thomas said to me in a low but firm voice. "Please, this is between you and me. There's no reason to worry Dad with something that's nothing." And before I could respond or protest, he left the kitchen to greet Robert in the living room, his voice suddenly cheerful and relaxed as if the last 30 minutes hadn't happened. I stood there alone in the kitchen, stunned by the speed with which Thomas managed to change his emotional presentation. It was like watching an actor switching characters instantly. This ability to mask feelings and present a perfectly controlled facade was something I didn't know my son possessed, and its discovery disturbed me deeply. Who was the real Thomas? The vulnerable and defensive young man who had just talked to me, or the cheerful and carefree son who was now chatting animatedly with his father about his workday? Or neither, or both? Do we truly know anyone, even those who live under the same roof with us for more than 2 decades? During dinner that night, I observed Thomas with new eyes. Each gesture, each word, each facial expression was analyzed and dissected in my mind, trying to find clues, inconsistencies, signs of dishonesty. He ate normally, told funny stories about eccentric professors at the university, asked Robert about a specific project at the office, laughed at appropriate moments. It was an impeccable performance of normality. Robert didn't notice anything strange. There was no reason he would. But I now saw what had perhaps always been there, but I had chosen to ignore: the calculated precision with which Thomas managed family interactions, the way he provided exactly the right amount of information to satisfy our curiosity without revealing anything substantial, how he controlled the flow of conversations to keep us focused where he wanted. After dinner, when Thomas went up to his room and Robert settled in the living room to watch the news, I had to make a decision. Honor Thomas's request and keep that discovery just between the two of us, or share with my husband what I had found and the unsatisfactory conversation we had. Each option brought consequences. If I told Robert, I would be betraying Thomas's trust, which could definitively destroy any possibility of him opening up to me in the future. But if I didn't tell him, I would be keeping significant secrets from my husband, creating a fissure in my own marriage. And if there really was something dangerous happening, I would have the responsibility to involve Robert in the situation. I sat next to him on the sofa, the television volume low enough to allow conversation. "Robert," I began, and something in my tone made him immediately take his eyes off the screen and focus on me. "We need to talk about Thomas." And then I told everything, described the photograph in detail, related our conversation, expressed my concerns and doubts about the explanation he had given. Robert listened to everything in silence, his expression gradually changing from curiosity to concern and then to something I couldn't completely identify. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he had heard. "Do you still have the photo?" he finally asked. I explained that Thomas had taken it back before he got home. Robert sighed deeply and rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture he made when processing difficult information. "Margaret," he said calmly, "I'm going to be honest with you. This concerns me, but perhaps not for the same reasons it concerns you." He explained that young adults often get involved in groups, activities, and interests that seem strange or incomprehensible to their parents, that this is part of the process of individuation and identity formation. "But," he continued, "what concerns me most is that he felt he needed to hide this from us, which says more about our relationship with him than about whatever was happening in that photo." Robert's observation hit me like a punch in the stomach because he was right. Had we created an environment where Thomas felt he needed to hide significant parts of his life from us? Had we been too judgmental, too controlling, Too invasive? Or was the problem not with us, but with the activities themselves, which were genuinely problematic and Thomas knew we wouldn't approve? It was difficult to distinguish between the possibilities. Robert suggested we give Thomas some space, that we not pressure him more about the subject for now, but that we keep our eyes open for other concerning signs. If there's something really wrong, Robert said, eventually we'll see other indicators. But if we're too aggressive now, we'll just push him further away. I reluctantly agreed, although every fiber of my being wanted to go up those stairs, knock on Thomas's bedroom door, and demand complete and honest answers. But Robert had more experience dealing with people strategically. His work involved navigating delicate situations with clients and colleagues, so I trusted his judgment. We spent the rest of the night in contemplative silence, each lost in our own thoughts about the son we thought we knew so well, but who suddenly seemed to be someone partially strange. The following days were strange and tense in our house. Thomas and I maintained a superficial courtesy, but there was a new distance between us, a caution in our interactions. He spent even more time in his room, left the house more frequently without detailed explanations about where he was going or who he would be with. When Robert or I asked casual questions about his activities, he responded with polite vagueness that technically answered the question, but didn't provide any real information. I'm going to meet some college friends. I'm going to the library to study. I have a meeting for a group project. All perfectly plausible, all completely impossible to verify. I began paying attention to things I had previously considered trivial. I noticed that Thomas had changed the password on his laptop, something he hadn't done before because we always maintained a policy of trust and openness about technology in our house. I also noticed that he began taking his phone everywhere, even to the bathroom, when before he would leave it casually anywhere. Small changes, subtle, but significant. Were they precautions of someone who had something to hide, or just the normal behavior of a young adult establishing healthy boundaries with parents who were perhaps excessively curious? About 2 weeks after the photograph incident, something happened that deepened my concerns even further. It was Friday night, and Thomas had said he would sleep at a friend's house after a birthday party. Nothing unusual. He did this occasionally and always informed us in advance. But around 2 a.m, I was awakened by noises on the street. I got up and looked out the bedroom window, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Thomas was getting out of a car I didn't recognize, a black sedan with dark windows. But that wasn't what alarmed me. What alarmed me was the way he got out of the car, looking nervously in all directions, moving quickly but trying to appear casual, like someone who definitely didn't want to be noticed. The car remained stopped for a few seconds after he entered the house, the dark windows making it impossible to see who was inside, before leaving silently down the street without turning on the headlights until it was a good distance away. I went downstairs quietly and found Thomas taking off his shoes at the entrance, trying to make as little noise as possible. When I turned on the living room light, he practically jumped in fright. "Mom!" he exclaimed, one hand on his chest. "You scared me. What are you doing awake?" I asked what he was doing arriving home at that hour when he had said he would sleep at his friend's house. He quickly explained that he had changed his mind, that the party had been boring, that he preferred to come home. "And who was in the car?" I asked. "I thought you didn't have a car today because yours is in the shop." He hesitated again, that revealing pause I had learned to recognize as a precursor to a lie or half-truth. "It was Jake," he said, mentioning a college classmate we knew superficially. "He offered to give me a ride when I said I wanted to go home. Whether I wanted to believe it or not was irrelevant, because my intuition screamed that there was something wrong with that story." Jake drove a light blue Honda that we had seen a few times when he picked up Thomas for commitments at college. The car Thomas had gotten out of was definitely not a light blue Honda. But it was 2 a.m, I was tired, and each confrontation seemed only to increase the distance between us without producing real answers. So I simply said it was fine and suggested we go to sleep. I saw the relief on his face when he realized I wouldn't press further, and that also told me something significant. The next morning, during breakfast, Robert casually mentioned he had thought about organizing a family barbecue the following weekend, inviting some relatives and friends. Thomas immediately said he probably couldn't attend because he had important plans. When pressed about what exactly those plans were, he provided a vague response about academic commitments he couldn't reschedule. Robert insisted it was important to him to have Thomas there, that we didn't have family gatherings frequently, that it would mean a lot. The tension at the table was palpable. Thomas finally agreed to try to reorganize his commitments, but did so with obvious reluctance. At that point, I was beginning to feel that I was losing my son. Not physically, he still lived with us, still ate our meals, still occasionally watched a movie in the living room with Robert and me. But emotionally, psychologically, he had withdrawn to somewhere I couldn't reach. There were walls between us now that didn't exist before, barriers he had intentionally built and fortified each time we tried to get closer. And the most painful part was not knowing if these barriers were necessary for his healthy growth or symptoms of something much more problematic. I decided I needed outside perspective, so I scheduled a coffee meeting with my friend Elizabeth, a psychologist who works primarily with young adults and their families. Without revealing specific details that could identify Thomas, I described the situation in general terms, talking about a young adult who began demonstrating secretive behaviors and creating emotional distance from his parents. Elizabeth listened attentively and then offered insights that were simultaneously comforting and disturbing. "Margaret," she said gently, "you need to understand that what you're describing can be completely normal. Young adults in their 20s frequently go through periods of identity redefinition that involve distancing from family, exploration of ideas and groups their parents wouldn't understand or approve of, and establishment of more rigid privacy boundaries. It's developmentally healthy." She paused before continuing. "However, there are also signs that distinguish healthy exploration from involvement in genuinely problematic activities. Sudden behavior changes, excessive secrets, unexplained alterations in sleep or appetite patterns, extreme social isolation, new friends who are never introduced to the family, signs of substance use, unexplained financial spending. If you're seeing multiple of these indicators, then yes, there's reason for legitimate concern." The more she talked, the more I recognized patterns. Thomas really had changed his sleep habits, frequently staying up very late and sleeping at irregular hours. His appetite had also changed, some days eating voraciously and others barely touching his food. He had lost weight in recent months, something I had attributed to academic stress, but which now took on potentially darker meanings. And as for financial spending, he worked part-time at a bookstore and had his own bank account that he managed independently since he turned 18. I had no idea how he spent his money. Elizabeth suggested that, if my concerns were serious enough, I should consider approaching Thomas in a completely different way, non-confrontational but grounded in love and genuine concern. "Sometimes," she said, "young people shut down because they fear judgment, not because they want to hide bad behaviors. They need to know that parental love is unconditional, that it won't disappear even if they make choices their parents don't approve of." It was a simple concept, but one I had apparently failed to communicate adequately to Thomas. I came home from that meeting with Elizabeth determined to try a new approach. I waited for an opportunity when Thomas and I were alone at home, which happened a few days later when Robert had to work overtime at the office. I found Thomas in the kitchen preparing a sandwich before going out for another night, about which he had provided only minimal details. Instead of asking accusatory questions or showing my frustration, I simply said, "Thomas, I want you to know that regardless of what's happening in your life, regardless of what you might be involved in, I love you unconditionally. There's nothing you could do that would make me stop loving you or wanting the best for you." He stopped what he was doing and looked at me with an expression I couldn't completely decipher. There was surprise there, certainly, but also something more, something like gratitude, perhaps mixed with sadness. For a brief moment, I thought he was going to open up completely, that this would be the turning point in our situation. But then he simply said, "I know, Mom," gave me a quick and uncomfortable hug, and went out the door before I could say anything else. This pattern continued for weeks. I would try to create openings for honest communication. He would acknowledge them superficially, but always found ways to exit the conversation before we got anywhere significant. It was a frustrating dance where I was constantly trying to get closer and he was constantly maintaining just enough distance that I couldn't reach him, but also not so great that it seemed like a total break. Then the incident happened that forced everything to a breaking point. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was in my home office grading papers when I heard an intense knock on the front door. It wasn't the normal knock of friends or delivery people. It was urgent, almost violent. I ran downstairs and opened the door to find a man I didn't recognize, probably in his late 20s, thin, agitated, with eyes that seemed simultaneously scared and aggressive. "Is Thomas here?" he asked, without any greeting or introduction. I said I didn't know, that Thomas might be in his room, and asked who he was. "A friend," was all he said. "I need to talk to him now. It's urgent." There was something deeply disturbing about that man and his presence at my door. Every maternal instinct screamed at me not to let him in, to close the door, to protect my space and my family. But before I could do anything, Thomas appeared at the top of the stairs. When he saw who was at the door, his expression changed drastically, going from confusion to what I can only describe as terror quickly masked. He came down the stairs hurriedly and literally gently pushed me aside. "It's okay, Mom. I'll handle this," he said quickly, and then went out the door with the man, closing the door behind him. I ran to the window and saw them talking intensely on the sidewalk, the man gesturing aggressively, Thomas with defensive posture. The conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes, impossible to hear through the glass, but clearly tense and serious. Then the man pointed his finger in Thomas's face threateningly, said something that made Thomas take a step back, and walked away quickly down the street. Thomas stood there for a long moment, visibly disturbed, before slowly coming back inside the house. When he entered, I was waiting in the living room, and this time there was no way he could escape a conversation. "Who was that man?" I demanded, my voice coming out louder and firmer than intended. "What did he want? Why did he threaten you?" Thomas tried to minimize it, said it was just a misunderstanding with someone from college, nothing important, that it was all resolved now. But I saw what I saw, and that definitely didn't seem like a simple academic misunderstanding. "Thomas William Carter," I said, using his full name in a way I hadn't since he was a child. Enough lies, enough half-truths, enough evasions. I want the complete truth now, or I'm going to take measures to find out what's happening on my own. He looked at me with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Measures? What measures, Mom? Are you going to hire a private detective? Are you going to search my room? Are you going to hack my computer and phone? Are you going to follow me?" There was bitter sarcasm in his words, but also a challenge. And yes, I had considered all those options in the most desperate moments of recent weeks. "If necessary," I responded, and part of me couldn't believe I was actually saying this. "Yes. Because clearly something is very wrong, and you either don't realize the danger you might be in, or you're too involved to ask for help." What happened next shocked me completely. Thomas began to cry. It wasn't discreet crying. They were deep and convulsive sobs of someone who was carrying a tremendous weight and who had finally reached the point of collapse. Automatically, I went toward him to hug him, maternal instinct overcoming all the anger and frustration, but he raised his hands in a gesture that prevented me from approaching. "No," he said between sobs. "Don't touch me now. Please. I just need—" I stood there paralyzed, watching my son emotionally disintegrate in front of me, but being prevented from offering the physical comfort that had been my automatic response to any distress of his throughout his entire life. It was one of the most difficult things I had ever experienced. Eventually, he sat on the sofa, head in his hands, trying to control his breathing. I sat in the armchair across the room, giving him the space he had asked for but remaining present. It took several minutes until he was calm enough to speak. When he finally began, his voice was hoarse and broken. "You were right to be worried," he said without looking at me. The explanation I gave about the photo wasn't totally honest, or rather, it was technically true, but omitted crucial parts. My heart accelerated. Here finally was the truth I had been chasing for weeks, but now that I was about to hear it, I felt afraid of what it might be. Thomas explained that the group that appeared in the photograph really had started as a philosophical study group, as he had said. But over time, it had evolved into something different, something more intense. They had begun not just to discuss abstract ideas about society and morality, but to experiment living them, to test in practice the theories they read. "Experiment how?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were full of shame and regret. "We did things that challenged social norms. Small transgressions initially, like entering abandoned buildings, doing unauthorized street art, small acts of civil disobedience. That didn't sound so terrible. Teenagers and young adults do rebellious things all the time as part of finding their identity and testing limits." But by the way Thomas was talking, by the gravity in his tone, it was obvious there was more. "But then," he continued, "some group members started wanting to go further, to push the boundaries of what we considered acceptable. And I went along because I wanted to belong, because they made me feel special, like we were part of something important and significant that normal people wouldn't understand." I began to feel nausea forming in my stomach. "Further how?" I managed to ask. Thomas hesitated, clearly struggling internally about how much to reveal. "There was an incident," he said finally. "Something that went too far, that caused real harm to real people. And it was at that point I realized I had gotten involved in something that was genuinely wrong. Not just juvenile transgression, but something that could have serious consequences." "What kind of harm?" My voice was trembling now. Thomas shook his head. "I can't give specific details. Not because I don't want to, but because there are people involved who could be in serious legal trouble if certain information became public. And despite everything, I don't want to be responsible for destroying lives." That wasn't satisfactory, I needed to know. But I could also see that pressing him further might make him shut down completely again. "And the man who came here today?" I asked. Thomas sighed deeply. "That was Marcus, one of the original group members. He wants me to come back." They continued even after I left, and apparently they're planning something big. Marcus thinks they need me because I had certain skills that I contributed to the group. "What kind of skills?" Thomas gave a bitter smile without humor. "Technical skills. I was the only one who really understood computers, programming, digital security, things I learned kind of on my own over the years. I didn't know Thomas had that kind of expertise. Obviously, I knew he was good with computers in a general way. All young people of his generation are. But advanced programming and digital security skills? When had he learned these things? "And are you going back?" I asked, though I feared the answer. "No," he responded emphatically. "Absolutely not. That's why Marcus was so aggressive, because I said no, and he's not accepting the rejection well. He's been trying to contact me for weeks, and I've been ignoring all the messages, all the calls. Today he apparently decided to confront me personally." This explained a lot of Thomas's strange behavior in recent weeks, the hypervigilance, the nervousness, the increased isolation. He was trying to hide from Marcus and possibly from other members of this group. "Thomas," I said as calmly as I could, "this sounds like a situation that could be dangerous. Maybe we need to involve the police." He practically jumped from the sofa. "No, absolutely not. You don't understand. If the police get involved, they'll investigate. They'll discover things about the past, about things I did when I was still part of the group. I could be in serious trouble too." So my son had committed crimes. That was the inescapable conclusion of what he was saying. Perhaps not alone, but as part of this group, he had participated in illegal activities significant enough that he feared legal repercussions. The weight of that realization was almost unbearable. As a mother, my instinct was to protect him at any cost. but as a citizen, as a person with moral principles, as someone who always taught that actions have consequences, how should I deal with this information? I need to know exactly what you did, I said. I can't help you if I don't know the full extent of the situation. Thomas sat back down, ran his hands through his hair in frustration. I participated in, they were like operations. We hacked systems of certain organizations we considered corrupt or harmful. We leaked private information. We sabotaged some websites and servers. Once, we helped orchestrate a protest that turned violent, although that wasn't the original intention. Each revelation was like a stab. My son, my sweet boy who cried when we watched sad movies and who always defended the weakest at school, had been involved in hacking, invasion of privacy, possibly contributed to violence. How did this happen? Was all I could say, more to myself than to him. How did you get to this point without us noticing? Thomas looked at me with eyes still red from earlier crying. Because you saw what you wanted to see, Mom. I was always the good son, the son who didn't cause problems, so you stopped really looking. And I learned to be very good at showing exactly what you expected to see while hiding everything else. There was painful truth in those words. Robert and I really had settled into our perception of Thomas as the perfect son, and that made us lower our guard. And now? I asked. What happens now? Thomas explained that he had completely withdrawn from the group about 6 months ago, had deleted all his contacts with them, had even changed his phone number, but Marcus and possibly others weren't accepting his departure. They saw him as a traitor or as a valuable asset they couldn't afford to lose. We sat there in silence for a long time, each processing the newly revealed reality. Eventually I asked, "Do you regret it? What you did with this group?" He nodded vigorously. Every day. If I could go back and never have gotten involved with them, I would in a second. But I can't. So all I can do is try to move forward, be a better person, and deal with the consequences if they eventually catch up with me. There was maturity in that reflection that gave me a small spark of hope. He recognized the gravity of his actions, felt genuine remorse, was trying to change. That didn't erase what had been done, but it suggested he might not be beyond redemption. "We're going to need to tell your father," I said, and when Thomas started to protest, I raised my hand to silence him. "It's not negotiable, Thomas. He deserves to know, and frankly, we're going to need him to figure out how to navigate this situation. He's more pragmatic than I am. He'll know what steps to take." Thomas eventually agreed, though with obvious reluctance. We agreed that that night when Robert got back from work, we would have a complete family conversation where everything would be laid on the table. Until then, I made Thomas promise me he wouldn't leave the house, that if Marcus or anyone else tried to contact him, he would inform me immediately. He agreed, and for the first time in weeks, I felt that we were finally beginning to operate as mother and son again, instead of adversaries in a game of hide-and-seek. The conversation with Robert that night was one of the most difficult of our lives. He oscillated between shocked disbelief, deep anger, and eventually a pragmatic resignation where he immediately began thinking about practical solutions. We decided we would need to consult a lawyer to understand exactly what Thomas's legal exposure was. We also agreed that Thomas would need professional therapy to process his experiences and ensure he was really committed to making better choices going forward. And as for the continuing threat from Marcus and the group, we decided that if he appeared again, or if the intimidation escalated, we would have no choice but to involve the authorities, regardless of the potential consequences for Thomas. In the months that followed, our family went through a profound transformation. Thomas began weekly therapy with a psychologist specialized in young adults who had made destructive choices. The sessions were difficult, but apparently productive. He also initiated a process he called making amends, where in anonymous and safe ways he tried to somehow compensate for some of the harm he had contributed to, although it was impossible to completely undo many of the past actions. Robert and I also did therapy, first as a couple and then as a family, including Thomas. working through the issues of broken trust, failed communication, and unrealistic expectations that had created the environment where Thomas felt he needed to live a double life. It was a painful process that often seemed to be leaving us emotionally more raw instead of healed. But our family therapist insisted that this vulnerability was necessary for genuine rebuilding of relationships. Marcus appeared 2 more times trying to pressure Thomas to return to the group, but the second time Robert was home and confronted him directly, making it clear that if he came back again, the police would be called without hesitation, consequences for Thomas or not. Apparently the threat was taken seriously because Marcus didn't appear anymore after that. We learned through indirect sources that the group eventually completely disbanded after an operation that went wrong and resulted in the arrest of 2 of its members. Thomas felt a mixture of relief and guilt when he found out. Relief for no longer being involved, and guilt for people he knew now facing serious consequences. The photograph that had fallen from Thomas's pocket and initiated this entire tortuous journey was eventually destroyed, burned by Thomas in a kind of personal ritual that his therapist suggested as a way to symbolically close that chapter of his life. But the image remains etched in my memory, a permanent reminder of how we may not truly know the people we love, and how external appearances can mask radically different internal realities. Our relationship today is different from what it was before I found that photograph. I can't pretend we went back to normality, because that version of normal was based on illusions and half-truths. But in many aspects, our relationship now is stronger and more authentic precisely because it went through the fire of real conflict and survived, transformed, but intact. Thomas still lives with us while he finishes university, but there's more honesty in our interactions, more willingness from him to share difficult aspects of his inner life, more mutual recognition that we're all imperfect and continuously becoming who we are. I learned that motherhood doesn't end when your child becomes an adult. It just changes form. I can no longer protect him from all the consequences of his choices. I can no longer control who he spends time with or what he does with his free time. But I can be present. I can create space for honesty, even when that honesty reveals painful truths. I can offer unconditional love without offering unconditional approval of all actions. It's a delicate balance I'm still learning to navigate. I frequently reflect on how I would have handled the situation differently if I could go back. Would I have asked deeper questions earlier? Would I have paid more attention to the small signs that were there if I had looked attentively? Would I have created an environment where Thomas felt more comfortable sharing even the darkest aspects of his experience without fear of devastating disappointment or judgment? Probably yes to all those questions, but I also recognize that I can't change the past, only learn from it. What I can say to other parents who might be reading this is, never assume you completely know your child just because they present themselves a certain way externally. Young people are masters at managing impressions, at showing different versions of themselves to different audiences. That doesn't mean you should become paranoid or invasive, but it means keeping communication channels genuinely open, creating psychological safety where even difficult confessions can be made without fear of love being withdrawn, and being prepared for the possibility that the person you raised might make choices you would never expect or approve of. I also learned about myself through this process. I learned that my identity was excessively intertwined with my perception of being a good mother of a good son, and that when that narrative was challenged, I had to do difficult work, separating my sense of personal worth from the choices and actions of another person, even when that person is my own son. I had to accept that Thomas is a separate individual whose decisions are his own, and that I can do everything right as a mother, and he can still do wrong things, just as I can make mistakes as a mother, and he can still become a good and healthy person. The journey isn't over, we're still in the middle of it. Thomas still has years of growth ahead of him. He's still developing his character and his values, still discovering who he wants to be in the world. Robert and I are still learning how to be parents of a young adult instead of a child. Our family is still healing from wounds that took time to inflict and will take time to completely heal. But the photograph that fell from his pocket that March day didn't destroy our relationship, despite my initial fears. It transformed it, forced growth that was necessary but extremely uncomfortable, exposed weaknesses that needed to be addressed. And for all that, although I would never choose to go through this experience again, there's part of me that recognizes its value in forcing us to confront truths we might have continued ignoring indefinitely if that photograph had never fallen, if I had never seen that revealing image, if we had never been forced to have honest conversations that were painful but ultimately necessary. If you're going through something similar with your own child, if you discovered something disturbing that challenges everything you thought you knew, I want you to know you're not alone. These situations are more common than we imagine, although they're rarely discussed openly because they carry shame and fear of judgment. But there's a path through the darkness, there's possibility of healing and rebuilding, there's hope that damaged relationships can be repaired even when they seem irreparably broken. It requires immense work, it requires scary vulnerability, it requires willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our loved ones. But it's possible. I'm living proof of that. So if my story resonates with you, if you're facing disturbing revelations about your son or daughter, if you're struggling to reconcile the person you thought you knew with the reality that was revealed, know that there's a path forward. It won't be easy, it won't be quick, and it definitely won't be painless. But on the other side of that difficult journey is the possibility of more authentic relationship, more honest, more resilient, for having been tested and not having broken completely. And that, in the end, is all any parent can really hope for. Not perfection, but honesty. Not absence of conflict, but ability to navigate through it. Not a child who never makes mistakes, but a child who can recognize when they were wrong and choose differently going forward. The photograph is gone, destroyed in flames, but the lessons it taught remain. And perhaps, just perhaps, years from now when Thomas is older, when he has his own children perhaps, he'll look back at that difficult period of his life not with paralyzing shame, but with understanding of the complexities of growth, the ways young people can temporarily lose themselves before finding their true path, and the importance of family that remains present even when the revealed truth is painful. This is my story, this is our journey, and I share it in the hope that it might help someone out there who's going through something similar to feel less alone, less ashamed, and more hopeful about the possibility of navigating through difficult revelations towards something stronger on the other side. And you? Have you ever gone through something that completely changed how you saw someone close? How did you deal with that discovery? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story might help another person going through a similar situation. And if this account resonated with you, please leave your like and subscribe for more real stories about the challenges and complexities of family relationships. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in our struggles is the first step to finding a path through them.